Welcome to the presentation on the regulation of medications, drug advertising, and drug information. First, we will begin this presentation by discussing drug regulation. Before we start with legal regulation, let's start with the naming of medications. Most drugs have a brand name. Typically, this is a name that the manufacturer has decided will help physicians remember the product, so it is easy to write a prescription for. Also, this name might hint at the intended use for the medication. On the other hand, the chemical name is much more complicated. This provides a description of the chemical structure of the medication. And lastly, there is a generic name. This is the name that the product was assigned when submitted to the FDA for approval. There are also branded generic names, which can be confusing. For example, Lanoxin is the original brand name for generic product Digoxin. There was another generic product that came out later, and the manufacturer decided to brand it as well for marketing purposes. So even though it is a generic medication, it has a branded name, which is Digitech. However, most medications simply have a single brand, single generic, and single chemical name. To understand drug regulation, we have to cover some historical events revealing why these regulations came to be. First and foremost, drugs are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. Within the FDA, there is a branch called the Centers for Drug Evaluation and Research, or the CDER. The CDER is responsible for prescription drugs. In 1938, a law was passed requiring that all prescription drugs be proven safe before they are allowed on the market. Prior to 1938, there was no such regulation, and so drugs that were never proven to be safe were used in humans. That's how we ended up using medications like cocaine to treat teething in infants. All drugs that were developed prior to 1938 were grandfathered in to the old regulations. So drugs developed prior to 1938 may still be on the market, and keep in mind that many have not undergone the same stringent safety testing as drugs developed after 1938. In 1951, the FDA developed two classes of drugs: over-the-counter or OTC, and prescriptions. OTC drugs are the drugs that you can buy without a prescription. In 1962, a law was passed stating that drugs had to be both safe and effective. This meant that drugs must be proven effective for the disease in which it was intended to treat. So, if a medication is indicated for migraine headaches, it has to be proven to be safe and also effectively treat migraine headaches. It seems crazy now that we waited until 1962 to make sure that drugs we were using actually worked. Unlike the law passed in 1938, this law was retroactive to include all drugs developed since 1938. So all drugs developed after 1938 and still on the market today have been proven both safe in humans and effective for their intended conditions. In 1997, a law was passed saying that drug companies had to disclose off-label uses of drugs. When drugs are approved by the FDA, they are approved for specific indications. Many times after drugs are approved, we discover that they work for conditions other than what they were intended for. Uses that drugs have not been approved by the FDA are called off-label uses. One important thing to take away from this is that drugs developed prior to 1938 have never been proven to be safe and effective by the FDA. One example of this is aspirin. Aspirin has never been proven to be safe and effective. Now this medication has been used enough that we know that it works for pain and to prevent heart attacks, but it has not undergone the same safety and efficacy trials that a drug developed today would have to undergo before it becomes available on the market. Prescription medications and the diseases they treat are the primary focus of this course. Prescription drugs are also known as RX, which is Latin for recipe, or a legend drug. These medications are regulated by the FDA, and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines what is required in a prescription. It is important to remember that there is a reason why these medications require a prescription. They are to be used only by the individual for which they are prescribed. This is because these medications may be harmful when used by other patients. These medications may be involved in drug and disease interactions. They can mask the signs and symptoms of serious disease, and may be involved in overdose or poisoning situations. Orphan drugs are a special subset of prescription drugs. While they are prescribed just like regular prescription medications, they are used to treat rare diseases that affect less than 200,000 people in the United States. Since there are so few people who would need these medications, drug companies are reluctant to develop new drugs. This is mainly because the profit for orphan drugs is far less than the drugs used to treat common conditions. To combat this, the FDA gives certain incentives to companies who develop orphan drugs. These benefits may mean tax incentives, patent extensions, or additional funding for clinical trials. Here at the University of Minnesota, we have the Center for Orphan Drug Research. The focus of this center is rare pediatric neurological disorders. Over-the-counter medications are also known as OTC, non-prescription, or self-care products that are available without a prescription. There have been a few prescription to OTC switches. Antihistamines like Claritin, Allegra, and Zyrtec, and proton pump inhibitors like Prilosec started as prescription medications and are now available without a prescription. Patients are given a little bit more exposure to medications without having to see a prescriber first. This, however, can sometimes create an attitude among patients that because they don't need a prescription, that these medications are safer. They believe there are less concerns with OTCs. The truth is that OTC medications have the same number of potential drug interactions, disease state interactions, and overdose potential. So patients still need to be very, very careful about the use of OTC medications. It is important to always let your medical provider know if you are using an OTC medication and ask if it is appropriate. Herbal supplements are also known as dietary supplements. They are not regulated by the FDA in the same way medications are. Instead, they are regulated as foods. Manufacturers do not need to get approval from the FDA to market products, and they do not need to prove that these products actually work. They can also claim that products address a nutrient deficiency, support health, or are linked to bodily functions if they have supporting research and they include a disclaimer that the FDA has not evaluated that claim. We have all seen this disclaimer on supplements. This statement has not been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. However, manufacturers must still follow good manufacturing practices to ensure that the supplements are processed consistently and meet quality standards. These regulations are intended to keep the wrong ingredients and contaminants, such as pesticides and lead, out of supplements, as well as make sure that the right ingredients are included in the appropriate amounts. Once a dietary supplement is on the market, the FDA is responsible for monitoring its safety. If the FDA finds a product to be unsafe, it can take action against the manufacturer or distributor or both, and may issue a warning or require that the product be removed from the market. Like both prescription and OTC products, dietary supplements can also have interactions with other medications and with diseases. Do not assume that since they are viewed as natural, that they are safe. We know that drugs must be proven safe and effective in order to be approved by the FDA for distribution, but what is the process for actually testing new drugs before they come to market? First, the new chemical structure must be isolated and identified, and then it is submitted to the FDA. Then the preclinical trials start. Medication is used in animal trials to see if it has the expected therapeutic effects based on the chemical structure and how it will bind to these receptor sites. Here we also look for adverse effects. If everything looks good in the preclinical trials, then the compound will be tested in healthy humans. These study subjects are people who do not have the condition that the medication is desired to treat. The purpose of this phase 1 trial is to examine the pharmacokinetics of the medication. In other words, to evaluate how it is dissolved, absorbed, and eliminated by the human body. Phase 2 and Phase 3 target patients do have the condition for which the drug is trying to treat. Phase 2 trials contain a smaller number of people and look at whether the drug is effective for the condition, as well as any short-term adverse drug reactions or side effects that might stop the development of this drug. Phase 3 trials have a larger number of people who are going to use the medication for a longer period of time. The last phase in clinical testing is Phase 4. This happens after the drug has been approved and is on the market and available for use within the community. It is important to understand that the evaluation of medications does not stop once the product has been approved and is available on the market. Through reports submitted by healthcare professionals and patients using the medication after it's been approved, safety issues can be tracked, and what may have seemed like isolated events, when grouped together in a larger population, can start to look like a trend. These post-market studies can lead to drugs being removed from the market or new warnings or adverse effects added to the package insert. Once drugs are approved by the FDA, they are given a pregnancy category. This category rating helps us determine if the medication is safe to use in women who are pregnant. Most new medications start out with a Category C designation. There are 2 reasons a drug can be classified as Category C. First, we have no data at all in humans or animals to determine if the drug is safe or not. Most drugs are not tested in pregnant women as part of the clinical trials process, so we have no idea if they are safe or not. The second reason a drug could be given Category C is that we have animal studies where pregnant animals were given the drug, and they've had babies that have had some problems, but we still have no data at all in pregnant women. Category A is the best, where we have studies that show that there is no harm to the fetus when pregnant women take the drug. Category B is slightly lower. With Category D drugs, we have proof that the drug can harm the fetus, but there are situations where the benefit may outweigh the risk. For example, if the life of the mother is at risk, then the drug can still be used. Category X drugs show evidence of human harm and should never be used, as the risk to the fetus clearly outweighs any benefit to the mother. As drugs move further into phase 4 trials and more data is collected, pregnancy categories may be updated. Here are some examples of medications that fall into the various pregnancy categories. We'll cover a few of these medications later in the course, but you do not need to memorize this list. Another classification that can be added to a drug after approval is a controlled substance schedule. These schedules are for medications that have a risk of abuse or to which patients can develop physical and psychological dependence, which we'll cover a little bit more in Module 6. The Controlled Substances Act from 1970 established categories or schedules of abuse potential. The Act also established the Drug Enforcement Agency, or the DEA. These schedules are established at a federal level. States can set their own schedules to be more strict with classification than the federal category, but the schedules of the state cannot be less strict than the federal schedules. Here are some examples of scheduled medications. You can see that the schedules go from high abuse dependence potential in Schedule 1 to lower abuse potential in Schedule 5. Some Schedule 5 controlled substances are available without a prescription, like pseudoephedrine in Minnesota and codeine-containing cough syrup in Wisconsin. Now that we've spent some time talking about drug regulation, let's spend a little time talking about the regulation of the marketing and advertising of drug products. The FDA has regulated drug advertising since 1962. At this time in history, drug advertising on TV and radio could only mention the product's name and hint at its use. If you remember the drug advertising activity that you did, this would be considered a reminder ad. In 1997, the FDA adopted new regulations. This allowed the drug companies to mention the drug product and its use. This allowed product claim ads, reminder ads, and help-seeking ads to be shown on TV. Now we know that drug companies want to get information out about their drug products, but do you think that drug companies will always give you the most balanced and unbiased information? Probably not. They're companies. Their job is to market their products. When you did the topiramate activity, what did you initially think that Topamax was for when looking at the drug company website? To me, it appeared to be for migraine prevention, and this indication for Topamax, but it was initially developed to treat seizure disorders. It is actually very effective for treating seizures. Why do you think it is being marketed almost exclusively for migraine prevention? My guess is because a lot more people have migraines than have epilepsy. So this is a strategic move by the drug company to spend more money marketing to larger patient populations. That said, this also tells me that maybe the drug company isn't the best place to go to for drug information because the information may not be as unbiased as we would like it to be. If we dig a little deeper, we'll find that topiramate, marketed under the brand name of Topamax, has been FDA approved for migraine prophylaxis and the treatment of seizure disorders. It is also used off-label for alcoholism, obesity, essential tremor, and eating disorders. Hopefully, this exercise illustrates the need to know and understand the motivation of your source of information. We will discuss this more in the next presentation on drug information. So, in summary, we talked about the ways that medications are regulated by the FDA. Be sure to understand the differences between the classes of medications discussed here. Also, be able to differentiate between the three kinds of drug ads.